This is Scott the Fix-It Guy. Our goal with our videos is to empower you to be able to do the repairs on your own and save a whole lot of money and also get that great feeling of having fixed it by yourself. Today we have a Frigidaire dryer that's making a terrible screeching sound, and this happens to all these dryers eventually when the rear bearing wears out. So it just doesn't have much of a sound in the beginning, but as the time goes by, especially with a heavier load, it gets a louder and louder screech. So we're removing the top panel by taking two Phillips head screws off of the back. We slide the panel off. Then we're going to disconnect these two modular connectors that are bringing power to the control panel. They just come right off, and we're going to break this zip tie by cutting it off, and we can put it back on later. And we are trying to get the front panel off. So we took the top panel off by removing the two Phillips head screws in the back. We're going to remove now these Phillips head screws on the top. There's two on the right and two on the left. And these screws are pretty similar from one to the other. If you get them mixed up, it's not a big deal. They work no matter what. So don't be too concerned. Just make sure you don't lose the screws. So we're taking them out of the left-hand side at the top. There's actually a couple more holding on the front panel after these are removed. You have to come down inside the dryer by about 6 inches, and there's another one right there on the left. So we're going to zip that one out. If it falls, it's okay because you can get it later after you remove the front panel. We go to the other side, do the same thing. We're going to zip that one out. And then we have to get the bottom panel off of the dryer. And to do that, this is a stacked dryer, so we're going to disconnect where it's stacked in the front by removing a couple of Phillips head screws. While we're here, we're also going to remove this little plastic piece here in the front. It kind of retains the tumbler, but we want to get the tumbler out, so we're going to take this off too. This is not a real critical piece, but it just basically keeps the tumbler from moving when you take the front panel off. So I'm using a standard head screwdriver to pry up a little bit on this metal piece that's part of the front panel on both sides. I don't want to bend it, but I just want to kind of pry it back slightly so that it's looser. And now the front panel is almost ready to come off, but there's a few more screws we have to remove underneath. So I am now disconnecting the dryer from the washing machine by taking out two Phillips head screws in the front. I'm going to lift up on the dryer. I'm going to put something in there to keep the dryer elevated. And I'm going to remove a couple of screws now from the bottom of the bottom panel. There's one on the right, one on the left. Once I get those out, I can take the bottom panel off. And hiding underneath that is a couple of more screws that is holding on the front panel. A fair amount of screws we have to get off to get into where we have to do the repair. Alright, so we're going to remove these two. Careful now because the whole front panel is loose. It could come off, so support it with one hand while you take off these last screws. Now we can pull the front panel off. It's all disconnected. And the next thing would be to take the tumbler out. We have to take the belt off, so I'm going to reach in with my right hand on this side and my left hand kind of underneath the tumbler. I'm going to pull the idler wheel, which is spring-loaded. I'm going to pull it off to the left, which takes tension off of the belt, and I can pull it off of the smaller little motor pulley. And now I can lift up on the tumbler from underneath by about 2 inches to lift it off of the rear bearing. So you have to wiggle and push up. Not easy to do. So you got to give it a little time. And once it's loose, you can pull the tumbler out. I'm going to grab it by the belt to help support it and get this tumbler out of the way. Then I can do a little cleaning before I install the rear bearing. Here's the part number for the rear bearing. This one's available at Amazon, but you can get it at a lot of different stores. They're not very expensive, and it comes with the rear bearing, comes with a new socket that it fits into. It comes with some lubrication and all the hardware you need. Here's the rear bearing that's attached to the tumbler. And this is the little socket that wears out because the lubrication finally dries up. And something that we have to replace. So it's good to put some tape behind the dryer where the rear bearing hardware is, and this is so that when you remove the rear bearing, there's a little metal plate back there that you don't want to fall, because it's what the screws lock into. So putting tape behind there, right in the middle, right behind the rear bearing, is a good idea. I usually use like some duct tape works, or you can use some of the metal type tape. I'm using a paintbrush to just clean up the motor while I'm in here. I have my lubricant that comes with the kit, and I'm going to put a bunch of it inside this socket, and also I'm going to put a little bit on the back because I want to put a metal ball bearing against that grease. The grease kind of holds it in while you put this socket into position. And I'm going to fill the rest of the lubricant in the tube into this socket, and that's what keeps the rear bearing lubricated, and it lasts a long time. Eventually, when it wears out, it starts to wear out the socket, and that's part of what's going to make that bad noise. So we got that all full. We're going to put the hardware on the front of it, and we're going to put 2 screws in to kind of hold it all together. And then I'll remove the old one by spinning out the 2 screws that are holding it in. And there's a metal plate behind it that's being held in by that tape, which is important because if I didn't have it there, that metal plate would fall and I'd have nothing for the screws to lock into. I'd have to have somebody back behind the dryer holding that metal plate in position. So using the tape prevents that problem. So I get this little piece off the old socket. Here comes the new one. I put it in position and I'll just zip it right in. And we get it pretty tight. And now the socket on the rear bearing will fit into that. The rear bearing will fit into that socket. So I'm going to use a standard Phillips head screwdriver to spin off the old screws on the old rear bearing. Just 3 of them. I'm using this long extension because then it's easier for me to get to the screws and hold the rear bearing at the same time. So I'm going to grab the rear bearing, hold it, and then zip off that last screw. There we go. Now on the new rear bearing, you want to take the screws that come with it and you want to thread them into the rear bearing before you try to install it. And this is to cut threads into the rear bearing. Normally they come not with the threads cut, and it's very difficult to install unless you do this procedure first. It just takes a second. So I did all 3 of those, and now I'll go ahead and put 1 screw in inside the tumbler, and I'll take this Phillips head screwdriver with a big long extension, and I'll get that into the screw, and I'll reach around the other side now. I'll put the rear bearing in position so it can thread right in, and I'll use my screwdriver to tighten that up. Once that one's tight, I can kind of position the rear bearing to line up the holes, and now I can do the other 2 pretty easily. So this way you can just do this all by yourself, or you can get some help, have someone hold it for you. So I want to get these really tight because we don't want these coming loose, otherwise the tumbler would fall during operation. Those are tight, getting rid of all this dust on the back. And now I'm ready to lift up the tumbler and put it back in. I have to lift it up, the rear bearing over that socket, and have it sit down into that socket. And just to confirm I have it in position, I'll grab the tumbler and I'll turn it a little bit to make sure that it's spinning freely and that it is in position. Next thing is I need to put the belt back on. So to do that, I want to just get the belt in position, and then I'll reach in on the right side, or reach in on the left side. I'm going to pull the either wheel to my left, and then I'm going to loop the belt back over the small motor pulley. And before I put it back together, I'll spin the tumbler a few times. You can see the fan moving while I do it, so I know it's engaged. I want to make sure that the belt's not going to come off. And then it's okay now to put the front panel back on. This part may take a little while. Take your time. a little awkward. You have to get it back where it was. I usually like to reach in and lift up the tumbler so it can sit back on the front bearing, which is part of the front panel. And once I have it in position, I'm going to go ahead and add the screws back in. I'll add the screws on the bottom first. So I'm putting in that Phillips head screw bottom left and then the bottom right, making sure the top is in there. There's a couple of clips that are holding it in temporarily until I get the screws in. So I'll go and put the bottom one on the right. Okay, now I'm adding the Phillips head screws back to the top. I pushed in the top on the right side to line up the screws. So we got 2 on the top, and then I'll do the same on the left side. And there's actually this one that's about 6 inches down here that I want to put in too. It's the hole right above the metal clip. So I'm using a standard head screwdriver to get this thing in position, and I'm using an owl to line up the holes. And then I'll go ahead and put in those 2 Phillips head screws. So this gets rid of that terrible screeching sound, and this will keep repaired without a screech for usually 7 to 8 years before that comes back. Then you have to replace the rear bearing again. So we're going to put in that other screw there right above the metal clip. Get that tight. And we'll do the modular connectors to bring power back to the control panel. And it's good to put a zip tie back in to hold it. We're going to put the bottom panel, put those pegs in first, and then we'll push in the bottom, put those 2 Phillips head screws back in for the bottom panel. There we go. I'm going to lift up a little bit and set it back down into position. We're putting the Phillips head screws back in that hold the dryer to the washing machine. And then we got to get the top panel back on. We'll put it on position and then slide it back forward. And we'll put the 2 Phillips head screws on the back. And now testing it, it did great. No more screech. So that did the trick. Hope that's going to help your dryer too to get rid of that terrible sound. Thanks so much for watching, and please subscribe when you get a chance.